So welcome everybody to this wonderful evening where we are actually able to gather and join in the celebration of Maureen Brownlee's new book, Cambium Blue. And I'm honored to be able to introduce her. And so I'd like to bring you out, Maureen. And we're going to, I'm almost thinking that because this is kind of an intimate crowd, I feel like if anybody wants to move a little bit closer, that would be good. If not, that's okay, no pressure. So I'm going to ask her a few questions. Maureen? She's, there she is.
Thanks, Sharon.
Yes. So here you are, and
Here we are.
Just to let everybody know, I think the format of this is it's an informal kind of questions and answer period. I'm going to engage you in some, I would like to talk to you about what the book, how you conceived it, some of the characters, the process of writing, and then Maureen is going to read from excerpts from the book. And then we would really like to open it up to you as an audience for questions. The only thing is that Michael has, we don't have a mic for you, so you'll ask a question and then I will repeat it to Maureen and then she'll be able to answer it. So, yeah, so congratulations.
Thank you.
It's been a long haul with this book for you.
It has.
And I just think it was a compelling read for me to read it, and I thought the characters were such diverse and compelling characters to put into this story that you created. So before we get going on to anything, I just wanted to ask you a question about, so there's 3 main characters in the book. I'm not sure if anybody here has read it yet. One character is a young woman named Stevie, a 24-year-old single mother with 2 children, and she lives in a town called Beauty Creek, a small mill town. Another character is Nash Malone, who's an elderly fellow who had a sort of an interesting checkered history, but currently lives in Beauty Creek and is kind of the junk collector. This book takes place in 1995. This is at a time when you could still go.
You could still go to the dump and get.
You could still go to the dump and get treasures, and so that was his. That's what he does, but I would like to actually open that up to, so Maureen, it's a beautiful character, beautifully written, and he has lots of layers. And the other character is Maggie, who is a middle-aged woman, a journalist. She runs the local newspaper in the town of Beauty Creek, and a widow, and has her own, I would say, challenges and demons. Living in a small town that is really on the verge of kind of one of those small mill towns with a history of boom and bust economy. Mm-hmm. So before we get going more into the story, would you talk about the characters, please, Stevie and Nash Malone and Maggie, and tell us why they were the characters that you chose to thread through this beautiful story of yours.
The thing about the way that I write is that I learned to write from a woman who learned to write from W.O. Mitchell and at the Bounce Center.
Yeah.
And he taught a method of writing that he called Mitchell's messy method, which was, or free fall. So you would just, if you were a student in W.O.'s class, which I never was, I was one generation removed, because I'm not that old. You would just write and write and write and write and write all day long, and you would hand your pages in, and once a week or so he would gather everyone in the room, and he would read snippets from the writer's work. He wouldn't say whose it was, but just places where they had fallen into a scene, into a character, into a place. And his idea was that writers would find their stories. They would find their voice. They would find what they needed to say. Mm-hmm. So I wrote quite a lot of free fall around these characters. But it is a very messy method of writing, and you end up with a lot of different fragments of different characters. And then as you begin to create a structure, you have to make choices, and then those choices become, in this case, these 3 characters. I really started the process of the novel, I was thinking mostly about the Nash Malone character. I was really curious about how someone from the interior of BC had ended up in Spain in the Spanish Civil War. So that was my curiosity, and that led me to, and then how would you tell that story in an interesting way? And then I'm also interested in women's history and women's stories and women in the world doing the things that they do, running businesses and raising children and being single moms. And so, yeah, it just kind of happens. And, well, no, that's not true. There's a lot of gnashing and wailing about how hard it is. And eventually, if you keep going, you'll get to a place where you'll get an editor, and then they will help you make it more clear and more clear. Yeah, so it's really quite a messy way that I work. It's not that I know the story and I sit down to write it down. It's that when I sit down with my fingers on the keyboard, stuff comes.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting what you say about messy, because I think any creative process that's one thing that whether you're a writer or a dancer or a theater artist or a singer composing music, it is a commitment to the messy. Mm-hmm. It is a commitment to knowing a sort of a blind faith that you have these things inside of you that need to come out, and they're in the form of a character like Stevie, or they're in the form of a character like Nash Malone, because you've been drawn to those. You've been drawn to that with your heart. So, but sometimes the answers aren't clear. Mm-hmm. But what I did notice about your book, Maureen, was that and maybe I might be reading this, I'd like you to comment on this, because I really thought that with all 3 of those characters, they were being kind of bombarded on the outside by things that the journey wasn't coming from their heart. So, for instance, with Stevie, a young single mother who had made some bad choices with men in her life and not really addressed what she wanted, and that set her in a very precarious position. Mm-hmm. Maggie running a newspaper, a widow, but the newspaper was always really run by her husband.
Yes.
And Nash, who grew up in the Depression, found himself in the Spanish Civil War because it was a survival for him, and he's found a way to survive in Beauty Creek as a junk collector, and outside influences are having him question the journey that he has taken with his heart and his life. Right. So I'd like you to speak to that. I found that to be kind of a central thread for all of those characters.
Yeah, the idea that the characters are on something of a journey and their lives are difficult and they need to do something is a bit of a central tenet of fiction. If the sun shines every day, there's not, right? There's there needs, so the idea that the characters are under some sort of pressure, and sometimes in fiction that pressure is internal, and sometimes it's external. And you're right, in Beauty Creek, a lot of the pressure is external because they're dealing with their mill has been closed, not something that they had control over. provincial forest policies, not something they have control over. The beetles are coming, not something anybody has control over. Yeah, life in the north is filled with things that we don't have any control over. So sure, all those characters are having to cope with pressures from the outside. And at the same time, they each in their own way have to make up their own mind about what they're going to do about that, and how and how that will be resolved for them.
Absolutely. Yeah. The way you weave the connection between the characters was also really a compelling, beautifully drawn, actually, because it came sometimes unexpectedly. The relationship that you developed between the young woman Stevie and the old man Nash was difficult, and the relationship she also had with Maggie. Would you talk a little bit about the Miles Kingston, the outside
the bad guy? This is where we all go boo. Yeah, well, you have to have a villain. It's important to have a villain, and so that idea of the other thing about the Miles Kingston character is the idea of an external savior, which young women can be attached to the idea of an external savior, but towns can be attached to the idea of an external savior, the idea that something from away is going to come and save the day. And sometimes that works out, and sometimes that doesn't work out. Usually people who come from away have their own agendas. So yeah, I wanted to just to explore that question. I'm not really sure what the answer is to that question. I don't really know that there's a solution to the question, but I think the question needs to be asked again and again and again, whether this is in our best interests, whether this is good for us, whether we can do things ourselves, or we need to wait for someone from away to come and save us.
Because the outside influence that you presented in that book is alluring. It's an alluring interest, and it is something that is being offered to this town to, give it an economic boost and brighter future.
Yeah, but, which is not to be sniffed at.
Not to be sniffed at. It's interesting, though, that with your three main characters anyway, and also even some of your supporting characters like Felicia, the woman who worked at the newspaper, and Dwight, and it was about. It all came back down to heart for me. Was this something that was actually coming from inside, like it wasn't internal. It wasn't an internal choice. So I think that's the question that needs to be asked with from a town.
Yeah. Where does our heart take us? Yes.
And I don't think towns really ask that question very often.
No, probably
right?
not.
I mean,
no. Yeah.
I don't think we ask that question often enough, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is important to question sometimes. Yes.
Would you talk a little bit about why you set the novel in 1995?
Why did I set the novel in 1995? Certain choices are imposed on you by your characters' ages.
Right.
You figure out. Yeah. You look at your chronology and you say, okay, if the character fought in Spain as a young man, then they're this age, and then you can't. So then you have to say, okay, well, how old are they going to be in the book? Then that puts us here. How old was Stevie when she had her children? So then that puts us here. 1995 was a place that worked for those reasons. Also because that was the cusp of the pine beetles were just starting.
Right.
There was still a belief that they could be controlled. The computers were just arriving. Life was just starting to change. Like the newspaper has computers. That's new. So yeah, I it worked for a number of reasons.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
worked to thread all those themes
To put all
together
those things
Yeah.
in one place.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no other particular reason for that year.
Yeah, it is a real cusp time, not only for digital technology, but also for, I mean, that was also when mills were.
Yeah, that was the beginning. That was the beginning of a big shift. It wasn't long after 1995. I don't have the exact numbers or dates. It wasn't long after 1995 that they unhinged the timber from the mills, which meant that the timber could go anywhere, and that was the end of a lot of small mills that had been sustained by the system where if you wanted the timber, then you had to run a mill in the area, and a lot of towns lost their mills in the 10 years after 1995. A lot of small mills closed up.
So what was I mean, you did mention before that, writing is a messy business and that you had these sort of amorphous ideas that were meaningful for you. What was the point as you were developing your characters where you felt like they were all going to, or was there that point? Did you ever feel like that you knew how they were all going to coalesce?
Well, the first draft of the novel, which was way back in 2015? Yeah, 2015, the first draft of the novel. My first editor was a woman named Sue Browning who teaches film writing at UBC, and she gave me a masterclass in structure, how things work. And that was that was the moment when I sort of understood how it could work, how the various threads and pieces that I had gathered together and sort of cobbled together into a first draft could become a novel. Yeah. So that learning about structure was really the moment where it was like, yes, okay, then I can see how it's going to be. And it's still, there's still a lot of work after that first draft.
There is a lot of work after the second draft and the third draft and the fourth draft. And
this particular book was edited 3 times because of the way that things worked out.
Yeah.
I had 3 different editors, and as I told Michael, when the book was delayed and then delayed again, and when that's happening to you, it's really kind of tedious, but now I'm not sorry that it had all that extra work, because it's much stronger and tighter, and
How did you find working with an editor after that was your first experience working with an editor?
Well, I'd had an editor for my first novel,
Loggers, yeah.
When you've lived with a novel for as long as I had lived with Cambium Blue, you have long lost your ability to see it for the first time.
Sure.
So you just don't have, you're not in a position to know what it's going to be like for a reader who's just picked it up and opened it and started reading.
Yeah.
Like you just don't know anymore, because you know, you just have read it so many times and you've been through it so many times, and you just can't see it that way anymore. And so that's what an editor gives you, is that gift of fresh eyes, going, well, and also the other thing an editor does is says things like, what are you trying to do here? And you go, well, I'm not really sure. And they say, well, you need to be sure. So then they point out the places where you've kind of fudged a little bit, worked, maybe your transition didn't work well, or something didn't work, or your connection wasn't quite there, and they just make you work a little harder at making it clear. And so that's the gift of an editor. Yeah.
It really is, when you think about, here it is, your book, this, 300 pages of words, and you think about how, I don't think we realize actually how much work goes into every word of a book.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And even for myself, when you pick up a book and you open a book and you read it, it seems like that's just how it came out.
It's just like this easy thing.
Yeah. It's just it's because and you don't really understand
Yeah.
what it looked like at the first draft stage. I think it's part of what's daunting for young writers is that we read finished fiction. And then when you go to try to create it, your first drafts don't look like that. They don't look anything like the finished draft. They just don't.
No. And I think, yeah, what you say, I mean, I certainly know with playwriting, an editor is called a dramaturge. And a dramaturge, it's a really amorphous we don't really, how do you describe what a dramaturge or an editor does? And really simply what they do is they know how to ask the right questions to the writer, to have, and not to judge, not to put it in a kind of a pejorative sense or a way of any kind of judgment whatsoever, but just to ask, to know enough about you as a writer to ask the pithy questions that is going to make it a better book, right?
Yeah,
characters.
just to draw your attention to the places where you're not sure.
Yeah.
And yeah, sometimes it's like, oh, you noticed. Because you've been working on it and you were really hoping it was done. As it turns out, there's still more to be done. So, and yet at the end you're never sorry that you've done the work.
No. Would you like to read
Sure.
something from your book? Yeah.
I had a hard time choosing what to read, partly because I know that lots of you haven't read it yet, and I don't want to spoil anything.
I know the suggestions that I gave to her for reading, which were the things that I was particularly taken with in terms of the power of the writing. She said no. Because she'd be giving away too much. So,
yeah, I don't want to spoil it for you. So, one of the characters, Stevie, is a young single mom who was pregnant and then married very young, and then her husband, is killed in an accident, and so you know that right off the bat. So I thought I would read you Stevie remembering what that was like, just to give you some sense of her character and her life. So she's remembering that first terrible night after Bobby's accident. Alone in the unfamiliar bedroom at the Jeffers house in Dayton, her mind had grappled with the unimaginable. Bobby was dead. All their futures, the this Fridays, the next weekends, the some days, the maybe whens, the in the springs, the next summers, all gone. Vivian is her mother-in-law, Vivian's doctor had prescribed sleeping pills, but Stevie hadn't taken hers. She wanted to hear the girls if they woke. Near midnight, her restless sleep was broken by the sound of a diesel engine. She went to the bedroom door. We came when we heard. Men's voices, a rush of cold air down the hallway against her bare ankles. Come on in. Big Bob must have been waiting for them, knowing they would come. It's a hell of a thing, Bob, a hell of a thing. She recognized voices, Wade Givens, the faller, Jerry Dundern, the loaderman. Was the whole crew here? She pulled jeans on under her nightgown, tugged a sweater over top, tiptoed down the hall. At the back door, a pile of frosty coats and cork boots thawed on the tiles. She could hear voices in the living room. She paused beside the breakfast bar, strained to hear the words. The corner at 12 Mile. At the top of the hill or the bottom? At the top. It always ices up there. You know how it is. Gets the sun, thaws, freezes. Where'd he land? There was a long silence. Stevie crept down the short staircase to the enormous sunken room. Big Bob was at the far end, standing behind the bar, the crew ranged around him, their backs to her. She huddled on the bottom step. He landed in the rocks, Givens finally answered. We could see everything with this moon. We climbed down. He must have been going a pretty good lick because he didn't land for at least 30 feet. Then he must have rolled. 3 times, we think, rolling, bouncing. Big Bob winced. Jerry elbowed Givens. No, don't stop. Keep going, Big Bob said. I want all of it. Stevie sucked in a breath, held it. We could see where they worked on him, in the snow. He must have got thrown out. Maybe the second roll, thrown forward onto the rocks. Another pause. Big Bob didn't flinch, just nodded Givens on. I guess the truck probably landed on him. Big Bob grunted, and every man froze, and Stevie kneaded the rough nap of the carpet with her bare toes. Givens kept going. It would have been fast, Bob. That's what McKerney said. Big Bob gripped the edge of the bar, rocked forward slightly, that he was already gone when they got there, that they tried CPR, but it was too late. They'd have been right behind him. They left at the same time. McKerney said Bobby passed them at 20 Mile, gave them a big old grin. They didn't see him after that until feet shifted, throat swallowed. Stevie pressed her shoulder into the gap between two stair posts. What about on the road? Big Bob came around the bar, stood inside the circle. Did he break? Did he skid? Givens blew out hard through pursed lips. I don't know, Bob. I just don't know. There were no skid tracks. McKerney and his boys thrashed through the snowbank getting down there and back up again, so maybe there was something to see there. But the way he landed, I'd say he went straight off that corner. If he'd gone off sideways, he ought to rolled. But why would he? It doesn't make any sense. Nope. If the corner was slick and he slid, he should have gone over sideways. You'd think. Could it have been the truck? Frank Gibbs, the bucker, spoke up. That truck was sound, Bob. We went over it when we did the brakes in September. It wasn't the truck. So he just drove off the corner? That's what you're telling me? Givens put his hand on Bob's shoulder. Not many men looked down at Big Bob Jeffers, but Givens towered. We'll go out in the morning, he said. We'll look again. We'll see what there is to see. This cold, this moon, everything will be the same as it is now. Whatever is there, we'll see it. You know Bobby, Frank said. He might have been fooling with the radio. Stevie felt the words knife through her stomach just above her pelvis, and she knew. Bobby had driven straight off the corner. She didn't need to see any tracks in the snow. She knew. She could feel him leaning over her, his elbow resting on her knee, his fingers twirling the radio dial, seeking, his whole body tuned to the faint brink in the static. On clear nights, they could pick up the American stations, Seattle, Spokane. Some sound must have escaped her because the room suddenly tilted in her direction. Stephanie! Big Bob crossed the room, gathered her under his arm, and led her back to the bar. She was hugged down the gauntlet of unshaven men, and a glass was pressed into her hand. They encircled her, these men who had known Bobby his whole life. They'd been putting up with his hijinks since he was 4 years old and had to be rescued from the uppermost branches of the poplar that grew in the shop yard. Bobby had been hyperactive long before they'd had a word for it. Stevie hoisted herself onto a bar stool, and someone said, "Remember the time?" And she sipped and listened to stories she'd already heard, and one or two she hadn't, and the bottle of whiskey was emptied, and then another, and they moved away from the bar to the Chesterfield and chairs that faced the fireplace, and someone built a fire, and more drinks were poured, and they laughed, and every so often Big Bob would drop his chin into his chest and rock back and forth, or Stevie would cry, and there would be murmurs about calling it a night, and they'd have one more for the road, and someone would think of another time when Bobby... They were still there at dawn when Vivian woke. She was hugged around the room and settled by the fireplace with a big glass of whiskey while Frank and Jerry went to the kitchen to make coffee and pancakes. And where was the bacon? Stevie got bacon from the freezer and set the table. And when Peg woke, needing to be fed, Big Bob brought her out and said, "Can I?" And Stevie said, "Sure," and heated the bottle. After breakfast, after Frank and Jerry had loaded the dishwasher and washed the cast iron frying pans, they had gathered Britt and Peg and Vivian and Stevie and divvied them among pickup trucks, and the whole entourage drove the 20 miles to the Jack Pine turnoff and up the winding road to 12 Mile Hill. Bobby's truck was still there. Stevie hadn't known it would be, and she was broken open by the sight of it, crumpled and whole all at once, upside down, black tires to the sky, what was left of the cab hidden in the snowy rock pile. There was a patch in the middle of the slope where something had gone on. She'd expected blood, but if there had been, someone had swept snow over it. "Can I go down?" she'd asked. Vivian had shaken her head at Big Bob, And he'd explained that there wasn't anything to see that they couldn't see from where they were. It's deeper than it looks, he said.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
That's a beautiful piece of writing. I remember reading that and just being so taken by the imagery and knowing that you are a girl, a small town girl from Milltown, and probably the familiarity you have with those kinds of characters, those kinds of accidents, that kind of aftermath, was something that allowed you to write that so beautifully. It was just like I was right there with you in that room and that through that whole thing. So yeah,
Thanks.
and yeah, hey, like I just feel like that has so much resonance for people here in the Robson Valley who would have a connection to a lot of stories like that.
Yeah, it's not an unusual story,
No.
really. Yeah, sudden loss is part of
Yeah.
all of our lives, right?
Yeah. But dealt with differently than, dealt with not differently, but specifically
In a particular way, in a particular community. Yeah.
Yeah, and that connection and that familiarity and with that kind of history, I think, runs through the whole book with your familiarity certainly with journalism and creating that character of Maggie. Maybe you would like to talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, that is a world that I know well. I think everyone here, perhaps not everyone here knows, but almost everyone here knows that a friend and I founded the newspaper that became the Valley Sentinel. And so I ran the Valley Sentinel for 10 years. And at a time very like this, I sold the paper in 1995. 94? 95. Somewhere there. And so it was a small weekly, and it's a world that I know quite well. It's also a place that sees the entire community. If you run a small weekly, you deal with everyone in the community at some point in time. So it really is a place where you can have lots of interactions with the community. So it's a place to, just to get a sense of what a community is.
And you really captured that with Maggie's character, and I loved the reticence that she felt to come, because she was a city girl, and to come to Beauty Creek.
Yeah, the thing about Maggie was that she grew up in Beauty Creek and she left on purpose, right? As often happens, the idea that real life happens somewhere else. It happens in Vancouver. It doesn't happen in Beauty Creek.
Yeah.
And so she came back reluctantly, but her husband was really gung-ho about owning a newspaper and really gung-ho about the idea of journalism and why weekly newspapers matter, which I think that weekly newspapers matter too. I think local newspapers are really important. And so she's come back reluctantly, and she's kind of stuck.
Yeah.
Right? She's sort of stuck. The newspaper isn't selling, and she knows how to do it because she's been watching it be done for years, but she's pretty reluctant about and that's Maggie's dilemma.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you bring this whole story into a global context with Nash and his experience with the Spanish Civil War. And would you mind talking a little bit about that without giving too much away to our audience?
And
it was 1937 was the Spanish Civil War. Franco, right?
Yeah, Franco. So sort of 37 through 39, and it's a very complicated. It was a civil war. There were a lot of different players. It's not as simple as as not as simple as it seemed to Nash.
Right.
There were a lot of things going on in Spain. But the simple story of Spain is that the democratically elected government was attacked by Franco and the nationalists, who were the old order. And so all across the world, and the democratically elected governments in Britain and the States and Canada declined to help the Spanish Republic. And so a lot of people went to Spain as volunteers to help defend democracy, was the idea. So that's part of Nash's journey, is that idea of, although coming at the end of the Depression, one of the things that Nash said is that lots of them went to Spain just because it was a job.
And they were hungry.
They were
and
hungry, they were
shoes,
starving, and they had nothing, and there was a lot of ideological reasons for that. And so lots of them went to Spain just because it was something to do. It was a way to get away from that grinding poverty that they were living in. And I was just curious about that whole conflict, and I read a lot and let that sort of percolate around in me. I mean, obviously, most of you probably know that there was a man in Valemount who went to Spain, who was a junk collector and a poet. So I borrowed some elements from a real person. So that character, that idea of, had been percolating in me for a long time, because I was curious about that. Nash Malone isn't the real person.
Right.
It is not. I didn't know the real person well enough, for one thing, and I didn't go looking for the details of the real person, because I wasn't interested in it being historically accurate. I was interested in creating a character inspired by, and so he just kind of grew into what he becomes. As I read more about the volunteers and what they did and what it was like for them, the character just kind of evolved.
I loved how you developed the relationship between young Stevie and Nash, because it was difficult. It wasn't an easy relationship, and they were both coming at it with their own kind of chips on their shoulders, right?
Well, they're complete strangers, and if you think about that, if you think of a young single mother and a really old guy, that's not a relationship that's going to just instantly develop. And so circumstances are. Which is also a small town thing, I think, is that a lot of our relationships are circumstantial. These are not necessarily people that we would seek out if we lived in a place where we had a lot more options. But because of circumstances, we end up having relationships with people that we wouldn't necessarily have relationships with. So Stevie and Nash end up having this, something happens for them, because they're thrown together through circumstance.
And you use that relationship to further develop their journey. I mean, it was just lovely to see how much they ended up having an influence on each other.
But we don't want to tell too much of that.
No, we certainly don't.
We don't.
But it's interesting how you created that evolution through the novel.
Some of that, that's the fun of being a writer. That's the joy of being a writer, is that you get to make stuff up.
I know.
You get. My mom is here, and she'll tell you it's true that I was a bit of a liar as a child, and so there's a great deal of freedom in being a fiction writer. You get to. It's a paradox. The idea that by making things up, you're trying to get to the truth.
Well, it's the whole notion of storytelling as part of our human condition, whether we're Irish, which are, of course, the bards, famous bards of Ireland. Maybe you've got some of that blood in you. But I mean, storytelling has been a way that we've created for our thousands and thousands of years since, to create meaning in our lives, to tell lessons about survival, to celebrate our accomplishments, to teach our children values and morals. I mean, it's fundamental. Storytelling is fundamental to, and some of us have are more drawn to that path, right?
Yeah.
And it's a role that we play in.
Yeah. But it's not all fun and games.
Well, like you were saying before, it's really true. It's a frustrating and messy and difficult and joyous process.
Yes, it's all of those things.
And often it is run by blind faith, and often you do not know where you're going, and that's when you really have to dig your heels in, because that's when you just want to, sneak out the back door and go have a glass of wine or something.
I have a building, used to be a woodshed. That's my studio. And right at my eye level, when I leave the studio, is a little blue file card on which I've written, "The trick is to stay in the room."
Exactly. It's absolutely true. Yeah.
And yeah, so it's always tempting to believe that it'll be easier tomorrow, because you don't know where it's going, or you don't know how it's going to work out, or you don't know what to do next.
But you're on that path.
But if you don't stay long enough, you don't get the answer that's there. Although that, there's no, if there was a tried and true method, everyone would be able to do it, right? So you don't really know, is today the day I should stay and squirrel away at it and I'll get somewhere? Or is today the day I should walk away, go for a walk, do something completely different, and then that will be the day that the idea, because that can work just as well. Staying in the room and working on it sometimes works out. Leaving the room and thinking and ignoring it sometimes works out. But if you leave the room and ignore it all the time, it doesn't work out.
and writers, we find what works for us, right? And
it's true. It's very individual. Yes.
With your, sticking a little note on a card in your book with Nash, you actually talk about that. You have him writing and sticking. He doesn't know what he's going to do, and sometimes he puts the paper in the drawer, and sometimes he sticks with it, and you don't know whether what's going to come out is going to be have significance and resonance for you as the writer or not, right?
Yeah.
And in the long run, it always has to come down to that. Does it have significance and resonance for you as a writer? And that's the only true path to go on, really.
Yeah. You just kind of listen. You're just listening to hear where the story wants to go.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's louder than other times.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would you like to read another passage, Maureen?
Would I like to read another passage? It is a tricky part about trying to decide what we want to give away, what we don't want to give away, what we will or won't do. I have a couple of I have two short pieces. One that will give you a bit of a sense of Maggie, and another that will give you a bit of a sense of Nash. Which would you like first, Maggie or Nash? Maggie. Maggie it is. Maggie Evans hated mornings, January mornings in particular. She hated getting out of bed to an empty house. She hated the shivering interlude between throwing back the blankets and being dressed. She hated facing herself in the harsh bathroom mirror, the gray hair at her temples, the deepening lines around her mouth, the sagging skin below her tired eyes. Most of all, she hated having to make her own coffee. In the good old days, before Mildred's desertion, Maggie would sleep until 10, shower, dress, and get her first cup of coffee and some scrambled eggs at Betty's Cafe just before the breakfast cutoff at 11. But at this ungodly hour, Betty's would be bustling, and the only thing Maggie Evans hated more than making her own coffee was making small talk before she'd had it. While the coffee pot dripped, she totted it up again. It was unfair that Mildred had left her in a lurch, 2 weeks' notice and off to the oil patch with her husband. Maggie couldn't bring herself to change the store hours. The Beauty Creek Chronicle, all your office supplies and stationer's needs, opened every weekday at 9. Set your hours and stick to them, Hank always said. Easy for him to say. He'd been an early bird, tiptoeing out of the bedroom at 5 a.m., even though she told him time and time again that she didn't even hear him going. Despite decades of marriage, their sleep schedules had never synchronized. Hank. A tear welled. She wiped it away. Let me see that, her mother used to say, cupping a teary chin in her hand. Nothing but a few drops of self-pity. She'd brush a rough thumb across Maggie's cheek. There, that's got it. Maggie had always thought the slings and arrows of childhood deserved a modicum of sympathy. 50 years on, with troubles barely approximating her mother's 14-hour workday without running water or electricity, Maggie could better appreciate that hardy pragmatism. Someone had to open the store, turn on the lights, and turn up the heat. She needed Felicia to work weekends, and Dwight, bless him, couldn't run the cash register. And the payroll savings were adding up. A few months more, and she'd be close to current on the overdue accounts. The coffee pot spluttered. She filled a travel mug, donned coat and gloves and toque. She started the car, and then unplugged the block heater and scraped a porthole in the icy windshield. She idled over the tracks and drove slowly along Main Street, mindful of the slippery patches lurking at the stop signs. The downtown core hadn't changed much since her mother's day. The hotel, kitty corner to the abandoned CNR station, a 2-block strip of shops, the dogleg past Cooper's hiding the new development that sprang up after they built the highway bypass in 1975. There were too many empty storefronts. Pennywell's Variety, Baker's Plumbing, Tilson Music, where Blake had taken piano lessons as a boy. The windows of Borden's menswear were papered over. They weren't all casualties of the latest downturn. Some had drifted away earlier. Most of the buildings were well past rustic, and each had housed multiple ventures through the years. Borden's had been a bakery, a sporting goods store, a shoe store, and the Sears outlet. She scrutinized the front of the Chronicle building, sandwiched between Halver's Insurance and the Beauty Creek Barbershop. It looked a little tired. The cedar shingle facade was fading to gray. She needed to have it sandblasted and refinished. Maybe next year. So that's Maggie. One more?
Yes, yeah.
One more. Nash Malone. Nash Malone. There we go. Nash Malone flicked off his lights as he turned onto the dump road. He lifted his foot from the gas pedal, let the pickup idle through the potholes. A sagging page-wire fence hemmed the road, channeling vehicles to the dumping ground. He parked on the far side, close to the stack of metal discards. He sometimes found valuable lengths of copper pipe among the cast-off appliances and crumpled sections of furnace ducting, but a light coating of undisturbed snow told him that nothing new had been added over the weekend. He pulled on his gloves and picked up a long-handled contraption from the passenger seat. He called the mechanical grabber Jiminy, after his last dog, a golden retriever who had roamed the town, dragging home whatever took his fancy: children's toys, burlap sacks, plastic bottles, doormats, a plethora of other dogs' dishes and bones. Nash missed the old dog beside him on the pickup seat, graying muzzle tipped to the passenger window, swiveling to attend to whatever nonsense Nash had to share. He missed the sound of toenails on the floor in the night. He even missed the 3 a.m. walks. But he hadn't replaced the golden Jiminy. The town had grown cranky along with the old dog, nagging reminders about a dog tag becoming a surcharge on his taxes, the tag delivered by mail, though he still refused to attach it. Twice Jiminy had been collared by some vigilante dog hater and delivered to the makeshift pound at the back of the public works yard. Nash had bailed him out, the small fine a minor slight compared to the humiliation of having to put his money into the oily palm of the village clerk. Jiminy, he squeezed the handle twice, the well-oiled cable and spring mechanism smoothly opening and closing. You're not much company, but at least you don't need a license. A feeble thread of smoke drifted up out of the pile and floated east toward the timbered slopes of the Monashees. The Beauty Creek dump had been on fire for years. It slumbered winters, oxygen-starved but never extinguished, sustained by subterranean seams of peat moss. In early summer, the sleeping flame would awaken and blaze up intermittently until the snow drove it back underground. In winter, the public works crew would ignite the top of the pile periodically to burn away a layer. Nash strolled along the edge of the pit, gauging the best route into the spew of bulging bags, some already split open in their tumble from the garbage truck. Household refuse, vegetable peelings, and tin cans mingled with cast-off clothing and footwear. Broken kitchen gadgets. Oh, I can't speak anymore, excuse me. Broken kitchen gadgets peeked between layers of cardboard and plastic packaging and broken lengths of lumber. Using Jiminy as a crutch, Nash edged down the bank to a small covey of wine bottles. He scooped them into his tattered hockey duffel and then used Jiminy to slice along the seam of the nearest bag. Clothing spilled out, jeans and checked shirts, a nylon jacket, a green down-filled vest. He plucked up one of the shirts. He was partial to a checked shirt with pearl snaps and button-down collars. He set Jiminy aside, held the shirt against his chest, and then examined the tag. Small, his size. It was unusual to find men's clothing in his size. He took the shirt and two more. He didn't need a new shirt, but he couldn't leave these for the fire. He left the jeans. He only wore denim in the summer. This time of year, he preferred wool. He kicked the clothing bag aside, sliced open the necks, plucked out 3 pop cans. These days, he mostly only bothered with bottles and cans. He could easily make $10 or $20 on garbage day if he got there before the fire took off. He breathed through his mouth, turning his face away from the smoke when it gusted. He was accustomed to the smell, burnt plastic crossed with rotting food and a backwash of fetid disposable diapers. The last of the season's lawn and garden clippings, well on their way to compost, added an earthy brine to the smoky air. It was too late for bears, but the ravens were year-round company. There was a sudden commotion above him. A raven, perched on the sign at the top of the bank, called urgently several times. "You tell him," Nash muttered. More idiocy from dog licensing bureaucrats. No scavenging. Not 20 feet from their brand new recycling bins. He scooped a 6-pack of beer cans into his duffel bag, shifted the weight off his hip, took another careful step. What was he doing here, if not recycling? Maybe he should run for council. "Hey, Raven," he called. "Would you vote for me? Run my campaign? Nash Malone for mayor."
It's the other thing that I found really wonderful about your book, and I think you will too in reading it, is there's a wonderful array of small town characters that are, I guess, iconic in some ways. They have we see them and recognize their their various attributes, and you've peppered the whole novel with quite a wonderful array of them, including I won't mention anything else, but it does add a whole buoyancy and color to the novel. So you get little snippets of their stories and how they are affecting the lives of the 3 main characters. So that was just another thing I loved about it.
Thanks, Sharon.
Can I ask you, I mean, this might be silly because I know what cambium is. It's in the pine, it's that discoloration, but just could you tell us why you chose that title? It's a beautiful, poetic title to me, but I just wanted to know if there was an inspiration.
Well, the book started out being called Beauty Creek. I was really attached to that title. And then some things happened and I needed to change the title. And I thought about, if you're a forester or a tree person, then it's not strictly just the cambium, but the cambium layer of a tree, as I understand it, is the place where the nutrients of the tree go up and down. So from the roots up to the needles and back down again. And so the cambium it is meant to be something of a metaphor, not just for the trees, but for the mill towns who feed Victoria, right? Who provide the nutrients and the money and the economic activity that sustains the cities. And so when they're attacked, when the beetles attack the tree and they ring the cambium, the tree dies because they're not getting nutrients anymore. So, and the blue, of course, is the color that the pine wood, the beetle kill wood has a blue tinge, which it's quite beautiful. But it's So that's where and.
It's a lovely poetic image.
Yeah, it's one of those things that when you start thinking about titles and where did they come from? I don't know. It came.
Well, I will say this, that once you find out what your title is, it's just that's the right one.
Yes. Yeah.
It's hard to. It has something. It means something. It says something. It tells the whole story.
It was. I think, and the other reason that I'm happy with it, because everybody who read it, at no point in the publishing journey with Harbour Publishing did anyone ever suggest that there was any problem with the title.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it worked. I think it worked all the way along. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
I would like to open it up to some questions for all of you who've come out to listen to this tonight. I just wanted to ask one more. You're doing a book tour?
Oh, yes, I am doing a book tour, possibly more than one. It's quite fun to imagine.
Exciting.
It's so exciting to imagine going out on the road, right? It's
wonderful.
Yeah. I have a publicist. This is new for me, so I tell people I try to get that phrase in everywhere I can. My publicist. So my publicist is working on more than one tour, actually. I'm going to go do a small tour of the Caribou because I took some Open University courses in 1995. After I sold the newspaper, I took some courses from the Open University, and so I'm an alumna. And TRU in Kamloops has taken over the Open University administration for the Open University, and so they've invited me to come to TRU and do a reading and a workshop. And so we're going to build a small tour, sort of starting in Prince George and going down through the Caribou and ending up in Kamloops and then up through Clearwater.
Great.
And I'm also going to be doing a small tour of the Sunshine Coast and over to the island and around a little bit. And way back in 2019, when I was going to have a book in the spring, I had applied to the Columbia Kootenai Cultural Alliance for a touring grant, which they do, which is through the Arts Councils, and I'd gotten a grant to do a Columbia Basin tour. So at the end of April and the first week of May, I'm touring the Columbia Basin. I start in Golden, in Vermeer, Fernie, Cranbrook, Creston, Nelson, Rossland first, then Nelson, then Caslow, then Nakusp, and then Revelstoke. So yeah, it'll be fun. Yeah.
And are you? Do you have a chauffeur?
No, I have a driver. No, that'll just be me on my own.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll just be me on my own.
And what about for the other ones? Will you be?
Yeah, I'll probably just go. We had some discussion. My publicist and I, we were discussing the Sunshine Coast tour, and she said, "Well, the ferries are expensive, and so we only have so much money for your travel budget." And I said, well, it's okay, because I have a little bit of a travel budget of my own that's kind of burning a hole in my pocket.
Exactly.
I'm quite happy to quite happy
Awesome.
to travel a bit. Yeah. So it should be fun.
Oh yeah, this will be wonderful. Yeah.
I do plan to write another novel. That is my plan. I didn't work very much this last 2 years. I don't know really why, but I tried. I went a few times, and I had a few sort of 3-week periods that I worked on the new novel, but yeah, I I gardened and made sourdough.
We were talking about that earlier when I was
Yeah.
speaking with Maureen, that you know, as probably all of you know here, that I have a theater company, and my show had been canceled, and so it'll be 2 years of, you know, not really doing anything theatrically or writing or anything, and we were commiserating with each other about the uncertainty of the arts and how that kind of it does create a bit of demoralizing, a bit of a demoralizing effect on inspiration, and also on just commitment to the act, like, because it feels like,
I think too that for me my brain wasn't fully functional.
it was just a very,
It was a very strange time for all of us, I think.
And I think people in the arts in general have felt that over the last couple of years.
And everybody,
and
really, everybody's
too,
been feeling that.
sure.
And before we get too far away from that, I want to give Sharon a chance to say that her show is coming.
Yeah.
So do tell.
Yeah.
When? Or soon? Soon.
Yeah, we're in rehearsal right now for The Last Good Valley on Earth. You'll be seeing some PR and ads coming out, and tickets will be on sale at Infinity, and then we'll be doing it in McBride as well. We open right here on the stage, April 8th, Friday night, and then we have a Saturday matinee on the 9th, and then a Saturday night show. And then we move over to McBride afterwards for the following week. So
Live theater. Yay.
Live theater, yeah. Yeah, we have a pretty wonderful local cast of 10 people and a crew, and just feels really good to be back in the saddle.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
I bet. Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's been a long slog.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
for
been
sure.
a really long slog.
Anybody else have any questions or things that they would like to ask Maureen?
Ask me a question. Go ahead. There we go. Wendy has a question.
I found as I'm reading, as I was.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely not picturing Valemount. My Beauty Creek is imaginary, so it looks it's some kind of hybrid cross between between lots of different small towns that I've seen in my time. And one of the things about fiction and creating fiction is that part of the trick or the craft or the magic, if you will, of fiction is that you want to leave enough spaces so that readers can imagine it for themselves. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to close down too many avenues, because part of the joy of reading fiction is that your imagination is triggered, that your imagination is at work. So your Nash Malone is going to look like your Nash Malone, and your Beauty Creek is going to look like your Beauty Creek, and I'm happy for that to be different than mine. Like it's very much about what you bring. Every reader will bring their own their own history, their own understanding, their own ideas to it, and if it works, it'll work for all kinds of readers. Where was I? Oh, I had one more thing about that. I've had people tell me my first book, Logger's Daughters, has some imaginary geographical locations in it, and I've had readers tell me that they know exactly where they are, and I'm actually
Happy.
I'm happy about that. In the beginning, I was a bit thinking that I needed to set them straight, and I've since understand that I don't. That really that's great. That it's wonderful that they know where it is, because I do mean for them to be that real. Yeah, Terry.
I think part of the joy of reading a book
The other thing, I want to just take a minute and say thank you so much for coming, because I understand how hard it is to leave the house after supper. Mm-hmm. And I really do. I really, really do appreciate you coming. And I really, really do appreciate you buying and reading the book, because, you know, it's a busy world and there's a lot of stuff going on. And I really do appreciate it. I really, really do. Thank you.
And thank you also to VCTV and Michael Peters.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
For setting this whole thing up. And so I think, Maureen, you'll be out to
I'll go
sign
out.
books.
I think I maybe have already signed everybody's books, but if there's anybody I missed, and if you need to get to the Valemount Cares open house, now's the time to go, because they'll be there for still another 45 minutes. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's the open house for the extended care seniors building, and it's at the community hall until 9 o'clock.
Till 9 o'clock, yeah. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks very much.